pleasure to introduce our final preeminent tutorialist today. Steve got his PhD in 1972 at the University of California, San Diego, and it's a delight. I'm delighted to say he got it in our laboratory. Unfortunately, I can't claim any credit at all for his innovative and creative application of economic principles to choice behavior. And an illustrious career which followed. Steve went from UCSD to Walter Reed, where he rose to full colonel in the Army and director of the huge division of neuropsychiatry. Currently, Steve is at Science Applications International Corporation and is professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. As you'll see, Steve innovatively and lucidly applied economic principles to the study of behavior. A few years ago, I was misguidedly asked to give a colloquium in Sardinia, Italy, on the economics of addiction. And I agreed to do it, frantically called Steve and asked if it would be all right if I lifted essentially his article, a beautiful review article, which appeared on the behavioral economics of addiction in the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior 2 years ago. Steve graciously agreed, and I went to Sardinia and gave a talk which was at least 50% pure Steve Hursh. And it's with mixed feelings I report that never has a talk given gone over so well. But now, you and I are fortunate to be able to hear the real thing. Steve Hursh.
Unfortunately, I was never invited to Italy to complete the story. So that must say something about the dynamic manner in which Ed Fantino makes his presentations, which is, I'm sure, accounted for more than 50% of the reception that he received. Today I will be talking about behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is not an alternative to behavior analysis. It's not a different discipline. I'm not asking you to make a choice between reinforcement theory and economic theory. It's not what this is about. What I'm going to do is talk about how concepts from economics can be used to broaden our thinking and allow us to think about behavior in ways which we might not have thought about before because we are been influenced by another domain. And so hopefully one of the things that you'll carry away from this talk today is a broader perspective on behavior, not an alternative perspective on behavior. It encompasses some phenomena that you hitherto may not have understood or even thought about, but which I think are fundamentally important if we're going to make behavior analysis apply to behavior in the natural environment, which is often an economic environment. What is behavioral economics? Well, there are a lot of things that go into behavioral economics, and there are many people that work in this field besides myself, and we all have slightly different perspectives on economic concepts as they apply to behavior. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on this definition of behavioral economics. It's the study and analysis of factors which govern the overall consumption of reinforcers, how much we consume, how many reinforcers we take per day of a particular type, and accounts for the overall expenditure of behavior to obtain those reinforcers. So we're looking at molar changes, grand trends in performance, not so much the molecular changes in performance that we often think about when we talk about schedules of reinforcement and operant conditioning. This approach seeks to answer some key questions like, why does the subject spend so much going after that reinforcer and behaving in that particular way? And why does it spend so little time doing that particular behavior or consuming that particular reinforcer? These are questions of behaviors in excess, like drug abuse, or deficiencies in behavior, like failures to consume the right kinds of food or failures to be consistent in the way we do our job. Key features of behavioral economics are things like we are principally concerned with the molar regulation of overall consumption and overall responding. And we don't think of responding and reinforcement as kind of the relationship between independent and dependent variable. We think of both of these things as being in dynamic interplay. The amount of consumption is dependent largely on how much you behave for something and is very much a dependent variable, just in the same way that the amount that you behave is a dependent variable. The two work together in a dynamic process. And as you'll see later, that process can be thought about as a relationship between supply and demand. We do talk about independent variables, but these are largely things like what types of reinforcer we're arranging for the performance, what price are we requiring the organism to pay for the reinforcer, and the income that is available to spend for particular reinforcers. And the dependent measures, again, are amount of consumption and the amount of performance. I'll be talking about 4 major topics, and I'm going to put that over here so we can leave that up for a little bit. I'm going to talk about the demand curve, which is a fundamental metric that's used throughout all of what I'm going to say today. And if you don't understand what a demand curve is, most of what I'll say will be a mystery to you. I'm going to talk about one of the key features of demand, elasticity of demand, the sensitivity of demand to price, and I'll talk more about that. Talk about consumer choice. You've heard about choice behavior earlier today in several talks. I'm going to be talking about choice now in the context of behavioral economics. And then I'm going to talk finally about how this can be applied to therapy, behavior therapy, and public policy that has to do with control of performance in the natural environment, in the community. The demand curve. What is the demand curve? How do we measure it? How do we define things like price and consumption? How do we define elasticity? And how do we quantify the demand curve? Put that over here so I can put some other things on this one. The demand curve is simply a plot of the change in consumption of a particular reinforcer as a function of increases in the price. A typical demand curve might be how much gasoline we buy as a function of the price of gasoline. And as the price that we pay, dollars per gallon of gasoline, goes up, the community and each of us individually consumes less gasoline. The sensitivity of our consumption to those increases in price determines the slope of this function. If we are very sensitive to price, then the slope is very steep, and our consumption goes down steeply. If we are insensitive to price, then the function will be relatively flat. There is also another change, various levels of demand we can observe across different commodities, but as you'll see later, the major interest of most of us in this area is to look at things that change elasticity of demand, sensitivity to price. Now, how do we define price? Well, it's primarily thought of as the constraint on obtaining the reinforcer, expressed as a cost-benefit ratio. It's one simple way to arrange a price is a fixed ratio schedule. It determines the number of responses that you have to pay for each reinforcer. That's one form of price. A more familiar form of price, of course, is the amount of money that you pay for each package of a particular commodity. And in some cases where the performance is a continuous type of performance, such as those arranged on interval schedules, it might be the time that you must spend doing something in order to obtain a certain amount of reinforcement. We often think about price, though, to be very precise in terms of unit price. If we're looking at the price of a candy bar, for example, we certainly wouldn't want to think about the price of a half gram or a half ounce candy bar for 50 cents would not have the same actual price as a 50-cent candy bar, which was 2 ounces in weight. Obviously, they have the same price in terms of money, but in terms of unit price, obviously the larger candy bar is less. So throughout what I'm going to talk about today, we almost always convert price into the dimension of unit price. We divide the amount of responding that's required by the size of the reinforcer. So we're always looking at equal units of price. And later I'll be talking a bit about normalized price when the two commodities differ in their weight. Fundamentally, one is heavier than the other. We then have to take that into account and normalize for that difference. Consumption is the total amount consumed, not just the total number of reinforcers, but the total number of reinforcers times the size of the reinforcer. If you're looking at food, it would be the total amount of grams of food consumed. If you're looking at a drug reinforcer, it's the total milligrams of drug that's consumed, not just the total number of reinforcers. That's important. And in some cases, we have to normalize this to take into account that different reinforcers have intrinsically different weights, and that needs to be taken into account. And then we look at consumption as a percent change from some baseline level, which is the level that's consumed when it's freely available. What do demand curves look like, and how do we measure them? Well, here are the filled circles here are demand curves by two monkeys for food. And what we did in the experiment was every day the fixed ratio was increased by 10%, starting out at a small fixed ratio of 10 responses per pellet of food, and every day the price went up progressively until it was reached a high price of 320 responses per pellet. And as we see, consumption per day gradually declines across these increases in price. And this is a common finding of a curvature in the demand curve with increases in price. And as we see with many reinforcers that are inelastic, that is, they are necessities, they're required for survival, responding per day goes up as a function of the fixed ratio size. We see large numbers of responses being emitted, as many as 30,000 responses per day being emitted by these primates to obtain food under these conditions of reinforcement. As I mentioned earlier, unit price is important. It's not so much the size of the reinforcer as it is the amount that you have to pay per gram. And if you do the same kind of study with two different reinforcers, one which was 2 pellets of food and another that's 1 pellet, well, we now plot demand as a function of unit price, number of responses per gram of food, you get virtually identical demand curves for the large reinforcer and the small reinforcer when you take into account the differences in unit price. Similarly, with drug reinforcers, if you look at unit price for the drug, that is the number of responses per milligram across these 4 different drugs, we see that all of the behavior for all the doses of these drugs conform to a single fundamental demand curve for that drug, except save this lowest dose of cocaine. So that again, we can collapse the different findings for different doses onto a single underlying demand for the drug independent of dose. Similarly with methadone. Here, Ralph Spiga was arranging different prices. He was offered each time the subject was offered a choice between a certain amount of methadone and a certain amount of money. And so every time they took methadone, they forfeit a certain amount of money. And as you might expect from the demand law, as the amount of money that was forfeit for each consumption of methadone increased from 5 cents to 10 cents to 20 cents, the amount of consumption of methadone went down, again showing the kind of curvilinear demand curve that is commonly found. Here we have a couple of demand curves that were obtained with 2 different reinforcers. They were initially equated for the amount of consumption at the lowest price of 10 responses. The filled squares are food reinforcement, and the filled triangles are a non-nutritive saccharin solution. And as we can see here, as the price of food was increased, the slope of the function was relatively shallow, up to relatively high prices. Over the same course of price increases, the demand for saccharin decreased radically. And we look at the output of responding, we see very large increases in responding for food reinforcement and large decreases in responding for the saccharin. This is the characteristically different change between an inelastic inelastic demand in one case and elastic demand in the other. Inelastic demand is that situation in which responding increases to maintain a certain level of consumption. It's relatively insensitive to price. Consumption is relatively insensitive to price increases. Consumption is defended to a large extent by large increases in responding. Whereas elastic demand occurs when responding decreases with increases in price, and consumption is very sensitive to increases. And consumption goes down with increases in price. Now, the boundary condition between inelastic and elastic demand is called unit demand, and this is the case where, regardless of the price, a constant amount of responding occurs. It's seldom seen, but it is the defining boundary between the two. Now, what kind of variables control the difference between control the level of elasticity of between different conditions? I'm going to talk about different things which seem to be important in controlling the sensitivity of consumption to variations in price. One is the distinction in context that you're using to study the demand curve, either open or closed economies, physiology and genetics of the subject, the types of reinforcers, and the availability of alternative reinforcers. When I first started doing this work, I was struck by the observation in economics of inelastic demand. It seemed to be contradictory to everything I knew about performance in the laboratory. If you increase the price of food in the laboratory normally by increasing the fixed ratio schedule, it was commonly found that you experience ratio strain, and performance declines with relatively small increases in the fixed ratio schedule. But then if you redo those experiments in a different way, you find a strikingly different phenomena. This is a study reported by Collier, Hursh, and Hamlin in 1972. Now, these subjects, these rodents, lived in an environment where the only source of food was that which they obtained under the fixed ratio schedule, a closed system. And when you study behavior in a closed system such as this, you find these large increases in responding per day, similar to what I showed you earlier with primates, with increases in the fixed ratio schedule, and relatively mild decreases in consumption across these changes in price. This is because these subjects were studied in an environment where there was no other source of reinforcement. In contrast to the open economy, which is commonly used in the laboratory, where we study the performance in an isolated 1-hour session, we maintain a constant level of deprivation independent of performance, which was certainly important for understanding principles of reinforcement independent of deprivation. But what it also did, and was the unfortunate consequence, was that we ensured that performance changes had absolutely no relevance to the biological regulation of the organism. It made no difference what the animal did in terms of what its daily consumption of food was going to be. And when you now allow a feedback relationship to occur between what occurs in the laboratory under the schedule of reinforcement and their daily levels of consumption, and a process emerges which we term inelastic demand. So it's important then to understand the context and whether there are other alternative sources of the same reinforcer available at other times, whether there is a feedback relationship between the schedule of reinforcement and the source of the reinforcer. Another variable that seems to be important is the genetics and the predispositions of the subjects. This is a study reported by Boyce in which he was looking at different pack rats. One pack rat was trapped in an arid climate where water was relatively scarce, and another species of pack rat that was trapped in a area of high vegetation where water was relatively abundant. And he was looking at water reinforcement under a series of fixed ratios, an ascending series of fixed ratios up to FR32, and then a descending series. And what we see here, this is a demand curve here, and this is a demand curve here, and then of course when he reduces the fixed ratio, we have reverse demand curves going in the other direction. What we see is dramatic differences in the sensitivity to price between these two different species of pack rats. Now, I haven't told you which species was the one that was raised in which was captured in the arid climate and the one that was captured in the forest. Can anyone guess which one is which? Which one would be more elastic in its demand? The one that was captured in the desert, or the one that was captured in the woods? The more elastic one would be the one captured in the area where there was lots of water. And it's just the opposite. The subject that's captured in the arid climate is the one that has elastic demand. Reason being that it's adapted for living without much water. And so it needn't behaviorally defend its consumption of water because it can metabolically defend decrements in water consumption. Whereas the subject that lives in an area of relatively abundant water has to behaviorally adjust if there is a sudden change in the availability of water. Nevertheless, there is this kind of genetic difference that occurs and may be part of the determination for elasticity of demand, and may account for differences in disposition to consume drugs, for example. There may be differences in elasticity of demand between different individuals based upon genetic factors. Now, how do we quantify these differences in elasticity? I've talked about them intuitively, and you can see that there are differences in the slope. But these aren't linear functions. These are curvilinear functions. So how do we quantify functions that are not linear in terms of any dimension of slope? And the metric which has been developed is what I have come to call P max. Most every demand curve is curvilinear. It starts out with some short period of relatively short or long portion of the price continuum where there is relatively inelastic demand, a point at which it goes through has a slope of -1, and then another portion where demand is elastic. And what seems to be the case is that this point, where it passes through a point of -1, varies depending on the circumstances. And if you look at the response rate function, it's an inverted U-shaped function of this sort. And so one convenient metric for comparing demand or elasticity of demand across reinforcers, across species of animals, across situations of alternative reinforcement is the price that maintains the maximum level of responding, or P max. And if you look at different drugs that vary in their effectiveness in maintaining performance, we see variations in the point at which the functions pass through a point of -1, and this various changes in the point at which the response rate reaches a maximum. And for these various, and of course this is a log-log scale. Nearly all demand curves are plotted in log-log coordinates because elasticity is a relative change in consumption with a relative change in price. So logging keeps all the units constant. So P max varied across these different drugs from a high of 486 responses per normalized unit of reinforcement to 110 for methohexatol. So it's a convenient metric for categorizing different reinforcers in terms of their resistance to the effects of price. And in the area of drug abuse is a convenient way, for example, for assessing abuse liability. How likely is a particular drug to maintain performance in illicit performance can be determined quantitatively in terms of the shape of the demand curve and P max. Now, another type of variable that is extremely important to determining elasticity of demand, other than the type of reinforcer, is whether there are alternative reinforcers available that could substitute for the one under study. In this study, we had the filled circles was demand for food in the 12-hour work session by primates in which that was the only source of food that was available. And we see the typical inelastic demand across a range of prices up to about 450 responses per reinforcer. And this very dramatic increase in responding that occurs associated with this inelastic demand. Now, if we arrange at the end of this 12-hour work period a 1-hour period in which they can obtain food at a small price of 1 response per reinforcer, we find a dramatic shift in the elasticity of demand during the 12-hour work period. And now we see this kind of highly inelastic demand with a Pmax now shifted down to about an FR of 40. So again, the one very important factor in determining the elasticity of demand is the availability of alternative reinforcers that can substitute for the one under study. And if you can do this parametrically using various amounts of free reinforcement, 1/3 free, 2/3 free, and you can see these gradual increases in elasticity of demand, gradual changes in Pmax moving to the left. And then if you further make food more readily available, in this case now they only have to wait 1 hour instead of 12 hours to get a free meal. We see elasticity has now become extremely high, and Pmax is now down around 20 responses per reinforcer. So we can see now that elasticity is a way to talk about different contexts of reinforcement, talk about different genetic predispositions that seem to support different levels of defense of a reinforcer. It characterizes different types of reinforcers. Some support high levels of inelastic demand. Others are very susceptible to increases in price and elastic demand. And it's a way of characterizing the influence of alternative reinforcers. And virtually all of the charts that I showed you up to now involved a line through the points. There is a quantitative way of characterizing these functions. I'm not going to talk about it very much today, but in general, it is the case that elasticity, when you measure it across the increases in price, increases linearly with price. And this leads to a formulation for a demand curve that can be fit to these functions and usually accounts for in excess of 90% of the variance in demand curves across many different studies in many different laboratories. Now I'm going to talk now about how behavioral economics deals with the notion of choice. I showed you just a moment ago that the availability of alternative reinforcers has a very big effect, potentially, on elasticity of demand. If you have a substitute reinforcer available at some other point, that can have a very big effect on what you will defend consumption of another reinforcer that is a substitute. The major contribution to behavioral economics to the study of choice is that it has forced us to think about reinforcers in terms of their qualitative differences. It doesn't assume that all reinforcers can be mapped to a single dimension of value. It says that some reinforcers substitute for one another, while others do not substitute. And still, there are still others which may have a complementary relationship. Now let me talk about these terms for a moment. Some reinforcers are perfectly substitutable. And many of the experiments that have been done on choice in the laboratory, what is usually arranged are several different ways of getting exactly the same reinforcer. Food, pellets by rats, grain by pigeons, and so forth. And what is really being looked at are different constraints on how to obtain those reinforcers, but they are perfectly substitutable. But if the natural environment arranges those kinds of choices, it's true. But many of our choices are between qualitatively different reinforcers that are not mutually substitutable. And how do they really obey the same kind of rules? And perhaps not. Many reinforcers are only partially substitutable. If we think of a reinforcer as being a constellation of properties, some reinforcers share certain properties in common but have other properties that are quite distinct. For example, a food pellet and sucrose are only partial substitutes. They both contain calories, but the food pellet contains other nutrients as well, protein, vitamins, minerals. And so we would expect that they would only be partial substitutes, and choice between them might obey somewhat different principles. And still other reinforcers are complementary. If you decrease the consumption of one, we'll actually decrease our requirement for another. High-performance cars and gasoline are two complementary reinforcers. If you have a high-performance car, you're going to need to have a lot of gasoline. And if the price of gasoline goes up, your inclination to buy a high-performance car will probably go down because of the need to reduce your consumption of gasoline. There are many complementary types of commodities, and one of the ones that's studied in the laboratory is the relationship between food and water consumption. Animals don't drink unless they're eating food. And if you reduce the level of consumption of food by increasing the price for food, what you see is that water doesn't become a relatively more attractive reinforcer. It actually becomes less attractive, and they consume less water. And then there's another category of reinforcers that are simply independent. It doesn't matter what you do to constrain one of the reinforcers. It has the consumption of the other reinforcer is totally independent. The principles that govern pure substitutes are not the same as those that govern complements and independent reinforcers. Now, these are not just hypothetical entities. We can quantify and operationalize these definitions. If you look at the price for commodity A and observe the changes in consumption of commodity B, the changes in consumption of commodity B with changes in price of commodity A determine whether the alternative is a substitute or a complement. If we're looking at price of food along the x-axis and we're looking at consumption of sucrose, we will see an increase in consumption of sucrose as consumption of food goes down with increases in price. And that would define sucrose as at least a partial substitute. But on the other hand, we're looking at consumption of water as commodity B. We would see a decrease in consumption of water. And that would be characteristic of a complement. And those are the defining characteristics of substitutes and complements. This is the actual data that one observes when you look at changes in price. This is consumption of food with increases in its own price, and this is increases in consumption of sucrose as a function of the price of food. And we see this substitutable relationship. And if we're looking at the consumption of water, we see the decline in consumption of water with increases in the price of food, characteristic of complementarity. Now, it's also the case that sometimes the relationship between two reinforcers is not symmetrical. A may substitute for B, but B may not substitute for A. And this may seem counterintuitive. But let me give you an example that I think will make this process clear. This is an experiment done by Marilyn Carroll, and she was studying the relationship between ethanol consumption and consumption of phencyclidine, PCP. And she varied the price of PCP, and as she varied the price of PCP and increased its price, consumption of PCP went down, and she observed a nice increase in the consumption of ethanol, as you might expect of a substitute. The ethanol seemed a substitute for consumption of the PCP. She then reversed the conditions and increased the price of ethanol. Now, she's doing the price manipulations not by changing the fixed ratio, but by changing the size of the reinforcer. But based on the notion of unit price, a decrease in the concentration of ethanol is equivalent to increasing its price. And so what she sees is this kind of decrease in consumption of ethanol with increases in its own price based on reductions in concentration. But what she sees is that the demand curve for ethanol was independent of whether the alternative was plain water or whether the alternative had PCP in it. And she saw little change, if any, in the consumption of PCP as a function of changes in the price of ethanol. So while ethanol appeared to substitute for PCP, PCP performed as an independent commodity to changes in the price of ethanol. Can anyone think of how we might, with Venn diagrams, define or diagram this relationship between two reinforcers, one which substitutes for the other and the other doesn't substitute for the first? Well, there are circles that look like something like this. One is a subset of the other. And this is very consistent with the physiology of these two drug reinforcers. Ethanol doesn't have a single restricted receptor. It has effects throughout the nervous system and affects many different features of the internal environment, whereas PCP has an isolated specific receptor. Ethanol affects that PCP receptor and therefore can substitute for PCP when PCP's price is changed. On the other hand, when the price of ethanol is changed, PCP can't substitute for ethanol because it is only a very small subset, comprises only a very small subset of the effects of ethanol. So behavioral economics gives us a broader perspective on choice when we're thinking about commodities that differ qualitatively from one another. And there's a whole range of interactions that we might observe, ranging from pure substitutes, which may follow a strict matching kind of relationship, to complements, which seem to follow particularly a counter-matching kind of relationship, to those kinds of relationships where one reinforcers, the level of consumption of one reinforcer is strictly independent of the price of a second. Now I'm going to talk a bit about how these principles of demand, elasticity of demand, and differences in availability of alternatives and substitutes might be applied to in the area of therapy and public policy. And I'm going to use drug abuse as the paradigmatic case. It's the one that I've thought about the most and provides rich examples of how behavior analysis from a behavioral economic standpoint can be applied. And I'm going to talk a bit about supply side interventions, demand side side interventions. From a behavioral economic standpoint, consumption of drugs is really part of a dynamic interplay between the organism's demand for drugs and the environment's willingness to supply them. As the price of a drug goes up, the willingness to consume it goes down according to the demand law, but at the same time, the willingness of suppliers to provide it goes up, and we see this kind of supply function. The actual market price and the level of consumption that we see in the community is the result of a kind of tacit bargain between the suppliers and the consumers. And this is the price where they both agree that this is the level that I will supply and this is the level that I consume. When we attempt to intervene in this process, we have various mechanisms that we can invoke. We can do things to change the supply by making the supply less available, by prohibiting the import of different raw materials, by imposing penalties on suppliers and so forth. We're increasing the price that one requires in order to get a certain amount of the drug, and that shifts the supply function to the right and intersects the demand curve at a somewhat lower level of consumption and at a higher price. Likewise, we can do things to change the demand curve by either moving it downward or increasing elasticity. And so I'm going to talk about various interventions which might be thought of as having influences on either the supply or the demand for a drug. Let's talk a bit about supply-side interventions and what the implications of supply-side interventions are. This is actual demand for cocaine by a group of rhesus monkeys studied in a laboratory by Gail Winger. She looked at different doses of cocaine, and it describes this inelastic demand for cocaine with responding going up dramatically across a range of prices that she used in the laboratory. And now let's take some kind of an intervention to restrict the availability of cocaine. And let's say we change the price of cocaine from 10 responses per unit to 100 responses per unit of cocaine. And what will happen? Well, yes, we have now done something to reduce consumption. We've moved down this function, and we've had some small change in consumption. But remember, this is an inelastic commodity, or at least the demand curve is inelastic within this range of prices. And so what happens to the response output is that response output, in this case, if it's in the natural environment, it's probably the amount of dollars that are having to be paid to maintain this habit. The amount of dollars that are actually being expended by the cocaine users is actually going up. So in fact, what's happening when you have inelastic demand, and if you arrange for restrictions in the supply by a number of interventions to reduce supply, is that you actually encourage the expenditure of more money to obtain the drugs, not less. There may be some small change in consumption, but by and large, the greatest effect is to increase the amount of energy in terms of dollars and time spent consuming the drug. Now, what does that imply pragmatically? Well, those dollars don't come from honest work quite ordinarily. The large majority of cocaine users are unemployed. Where do they get their money? Largely from engaging in activities which are criminal in form. And so part of the effect is to increase the necessity to engage in criminal activity to obtain the money to purchase the drug. And where does the money go? Well, the money goes to suppliers who provide the drug. And just like restrictions on oil produce windfall profits for those who produced oil in the early 70s, one of the unintended consequences of restricting the supply of a drug is that there are windfall increases in the amount of money that the suppliers can obtain, and an unintended increase in the incentive to engage in supplying the drug. Now, admittedly, if we can increase the price enough, we can go beyond the point of Pmax and have restrictions in consumption that would produce dramatic changes in consumption and even reductions in total outlays of expenditure. But these may be beyond what we would tolerate in a free society. The kind of draconian measures that might be imposed to do that might not be acceptable to most of us. Restrictions on the ability to move about, restrictions to engage in commerce, and so forth. So one notion that we have to understand when we're talking about supply-side intervention is what is the elasticity of demand? And if we don't know where we are on the demand curve in terms of elasticity, we may not get the kinds of changes in performance that we're expecting. So that means that we have to think about changes not only in the supply, but in terms of reducing demand. And here I'm talking primarily about changes that would increase elasticity of demand. And one obvious intervention is to provide alternative reinforcers. And this is a study done by Marilyn Carroll where she was studying PCP consumption in primates. Here is PCP consumption studied in isolation with no other reinforcer available. And we see this inelastic demand and large increases in responding for PCP up to a Pmax of 415. She studied in the same animals a consumption of PCP when there was an alternative saccharin solution available. It was a concurrent schedule. There was no requirement that they cease consuming PCP in order to get the saccharin. But nevertheless, just the pure availability of an alternative reinforcer increased elasticity of demand for PCP and moved the Pmax from 415 down to 160. So the consumption of this drug was sensitive to the availability of an alternative reinforcer that perhaps substituted for it. However, it certainly didn't eliminate the drug consumption. It's still a fairly robust performance despite the availability of the alternative reinforcer. So another way and one reason why there may not have been very much competition is that there was no requirement to cease consuming the drug in order to get the alternative. There was no interlocking contingency between the two performances. But if you arrange a different kind of situation in which there is a relationship between consumption of one and consumption of the other, we do see changes. Here is a study reported by Elsmore in which baboons were given a choice throughout the day for either taking some food or taking some heroin. On every given trial, they could only have one or the other. They couldn't have both. So every choice for food meant that they had to forego some heroin. And every choice of heroin meant they had to forego some food. And across conditions of the experiment, they increased the time between trials, which had the effect of reducing the number of trials per day. And by doing this, what happened was that the subjects tended to defend their level of food consumption by continuing to make about as many choices for food as they had before. And they gave up consumption of the heroin in order to defend their levels of food consumption. So this kind of interlocking contingency, where the consumption of the one requires abstinence from the other, seems to be relatively effective in affecting the consumption of a drug. And I've just participated in a symposium where many of the studies involve the use of vouchers to do exactly this with human subjects. A voucher for exchangeable for goods and services is arranged for the abstinence for a clean urine from either cocaine or heroin or a reduction in CO2 in cigarette smokers. And what's seen is that as you increase the size of the voucher, you see increasing amounts of abstinence, which is suggestive that increases in the cost of obtaining if you take the drug, you will have a dirty urine, and that dirty urine forces you to forego the voucher. The higher the price of having a dirty urine, the more likely it is that they'll abstain and show effects of the arranged contingency between abstinence and the reinforcer. So one of the important features that we found is that interlocking contingencies that require change in the performance of one in order to earn the other is an important feature that increases the likelihood of compliance with the regimen. Another approach that's being worked on heavily within the drug abuse community is the development of medications to make us less likely to consume the drug, perhaps physiologically reduce our demand for the drug, or eliminate the reinforcing properties of the drug. And these medications are being sought for cocaine and so forth. What I'd like to talk about a little bit is what we might expect of a medication that we might arrange for a drug, and what it might do in terms of behavioral economics. Now, one medication that's been available for a long time for treating opiate abuse is naloxone or naltrexone. These two drugs specifically bind to the opiate receptor and block the reinforcing properties of the opiate. And if you take naloxone, you cannot be reinforced by an opiate. It pharmacologically prevents the reinforcement from occurring. In a study that was conducted by Harrigan and Downs, they had primates who were equipped to obtain morphine, infused morphine, by pressing a lever. And in the open squares is a demand curve for the morphine across different prices arranged by changing the dose of the morphine that was delivered. And we see this kind of curvilinear demand curve that we have seen so often before. Now, in other conditions of the experiment, he arranged for a continuous infusion of naltrexone, this antagonist which prevents reinforcement by the morphine. And as he increased the level of the naltrexone in 3 different steps. And what he found was that it didn't change the elasticity of demand, at least not if you compute this in terms of normalized units. The demand curve for morphine with the antagonist on board was exactly the same as the demand curve for morphine when the antagonist was not on board. But what it did do was change the qualitative effect of each morphine infusion. Now, this is a particular dose of morphine at a particular price without the naltrexone available. And this symbol is that very same dose of morphine when naltrexone was at the highest dose. And what it did was, naloxone had the effect of diminishing the qualitative value of the morphine so that it was functionally a smaller reinforcer. And if it's a smaller reinforcer, this has the effect of making the price that much larger. And it simply moved performance down the demand curve to a functionally higher price and had the attendant change in consumption, almost a log change in consumption of that particular dose of morphine when naltrexone was available, and moved the effective, as a result of this effective change in price. So one of the effects of an antagonist is to make the qualitative value of the reinforcer smaller, and that has the effect of pharmacologically raising the psychological price, if you will, of the commodity. And that has the effect of moving you further out on the demand curve. Now, at the limit, if you deliver a sufficient amount of naltrexone to a subject, the reinforcer will have zero value. That would be somewhere way out here. And in that case, there would be, you would expect no performance to occur. And that, in fact, is what happens. Now, the problem that we have with this kind of a therapy approach is that it forces the subject. Now, if the subject is offered the opportunity to engage in this kind of therapy, what we're asking the subject to do is voluntarily submit to a therapy which will increase the price that he has to pay for a certain psychological impact of the drug that he's consuming. And so this kind of a choice for a higher price set of conditions is unlikely to occur voluntarily unless there are other inducements that would make that choice valuable to the individual. Now, this kind of therapy has worked with physicians where there is an alternative inducement to submit to a condition which increases the qualitative price of the substance of abuse. They have a job that they can maintain, it's a very lucrative profession, and so forth. They have family and so forth. That maintains as a support for this kind of shift. Whereas there are other individuals where there is no economic inducement, it's unlikely that kind of antagonist therapy would be voluntarily submitted to. But an economic analysis gives us a framework for understanding what the therapeutic intervention is arranging for the subject and whether we're likely to see a change and how large that change is going to be. A final type of intervention for drug abuse has been the offering of an agonist substitute for the drug of abuse. And the most common example of this is the offering of methadone to opiate users. Now, methadone is a substitute. It's a partial substitute for opiates. It eliminates the sensations of withdrawal and has has a small portion of the euphoric effects of standard opiate use. So methadone is a substitute for heroin consumption, and it has, when it's used at appropriate doses and when the doses are made readily available with relatively little delays imposed, can be very effective in reducing the levels of heroin abuse. But in general, there have been very few studies that have looked at the application of substitute agonists and their effects quantitatively on the demand for that reinforcer. But if you'll think back now to the study that I showed you earlier, where I had animals responding for food in a work session, and I was providing free food later, this is a kind of analog to a situation where we provide a free agonist in competition to the illicit drug. And what we found, if I can show you those results again, is that if you increase the availability of a substitute reinforcer at some other time, you see this kind of progressive increase in elasticity and attendant shift of Pmax to the left and very large decreases in the amount of responding. Now, what kind of a therapy intervention does this suggest? Well, it suggests perhaps that one way to reduce illicit consumption of a drug is to medically provide that drug through clinical applications of the drug, relatively free, simply for coming to the clinic to obtain it. This would increase elasticity of demand for the drug in the illicit economy, reduce expenditures in the illicit commodity. It would reduce the amount of money that's in the illicit economy. reduce the incentive to engage in supply, reduce the requirement to engage in criminal behavior to obtain the drug. So there are many attendant virtues that would be involved in providing the drug relatively inexpensively through a clinical, through a medicalized or clinical program. Now, there are a couple of caveats to this kind of medical availability of a substitute source of the drug of abuse. First, it does not imply legalization. Legalization means that we make the price relatively market dependent. And what that means is that it may become very low. Now, observe what happens in this kind of a situation where we have manipulated the availability of an alternative reinforcer. We see this kind of fanning out demand curves. And we've seen that over and over again, and I've shown you many examples of fanning out demand curves. At low prices, the demand curves are relatively similar. And they maintain relatively inelastic demand. It is only at relatively high prices that the availability of the alternative had any impact on elasticity of demand. We see this kind of fanning out demand curves. And we've seen that over and over again, and I've shown you many examples of fanning out demand curves. At low prices, the demand curves are relatively similar. And they maintain relatively inelastic demand. It is only at relatively high prices that the availability of the alternative had any impact on elasticity of demand. What this implies is that a medicalized program of providing alternative sources of the illicit drug will only have large effects if the price for the illicit drug in the natural environment remains relatively high. That would encourage the kind of increases in elasticity that you see here. Now, one other caveat to this is that it does not eliminate drug abuse. Clearly, what will happen is that the drugs will simply be consumed in another location under different circumstances, but the level of consumption may not actually go down. It can be shown, I think, that the level of consumption may not go up, particularly if the individual is allowed to control its own dose and its own regimen of consumption. But it does not eliminate drug abuse. It eliminates maybe the crime associated with drug abuse, and it may eliminate the incentive to engage in supply and the recruitment of new drug abusers. But it doesn't eliminate drug abuse in those who are currently using. That would be what would be required in that case is further interventions within the therapeutic environment once the individual has become associated with that clinic to further arrange contingencies to reduce the consumption of the reinforcer, either the use of vouchers or some other kinds of community-based reinforcement procedures. So what I'm suggesting here is not a single panacea for drug abuse, but the application of economic principles to increase the elasticity of demand in the marketplace, reduce the incentives to engage in that kind of behavior, bring the performance into a clinic where it can then be susceptible to the impact of other contingencies and other interventions, and hopefully to eliminate the problem. It's part of a larger package. Stimulated by our thinking, though, in economic terms about this as an economic problem. This allows us to then to talk about policy from an economic perspective and where should we put our dollars. And it has immediate impact on demand side and supply side decisions that are made every day by the government in terms of where it should invest tax dollars in control of drug abuse and other interventions by government to influence performances. Do you have any questions about? One final pitch is that what I'm suggesting is that we ought to engage in a continuous process of empirical research to generate principles that can be tested through economic analysis to generate public policy that can be tried in small projects, ultimately leading to general policies that can then be evaluated in economic terms, producing ultimately a dynamic state, a dynamic principle controlling policy rather than the static a priori notions of policy that seem to be the principal way the policy is structured today. Yes, Bill.
I keep hearing about some program in Great Britain where people were given heroin and they basically had no disruption in their life and they all got off heroin after 5 or 10 years. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah,
I was on 60 Minutes or
right.
Oprah or one of those.
Yeah, there have been experiments of this sort, and I think that the important thing to understand about a lot of these experiments is that the impact of the experiment will have a lot to do not just with the general policy that's being employed, but some of the details of the contingencies that are arranged. And a program, I can think of many ways a program like this would fail. In many ways, it would succeed. Obviously, the likelihood that a drug abuser will reduce their consumption of a drug will depend not just on the economic forces that are arranged, but on a lot of the molecular things that have to do with the likelihood that they're going to have opportunities to abuse the drug, the ability to hold down a job, and the job skills, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that you can do that would prevent this thing from working. What I'm suggesting is that one of the things that you do need to do is to make sure that you're not working against the economics of the situation. You know, it's if you arrange it so that the economics are working against you, you're going uphill. But if you arrange it so that the economics are working on your behalf, then your likelihood of success is greater. It doesn't ensure success because there's a lot of other things that have to be arranged too. But by understanding the economic context, we can arrange for an increased likelihood that those other interventions will work. Yes, sir. Well, the problem with a lot of methadone programs, and I'm going to sound kind of critical here, there's been a lot of sort of ethical constraints placed on methadone maintenance programs. Limits on how big a dose you can provide, how often you can provide it, and whether the individuals can take the dose home with them, and so forth. And many of these things work against economics. If you're competing with an illicit marketplace, and the illicit marketplace is exquisitely responsive to market dynamics. And you provide methadone on certain times of day with a certain dose, the illicit economy is going to respond by providing a higher dose for a lower price, available more frequently and more conveniently. And so if you have a static program that's delimited by certain arbitrary rules that restrict the dose that you can provide and restrict the times at which they're available, you're going to be working against economics. But if you give the therapeutic environment the ability to set the dose, to match what's required to maintain performance, you arrange for take-home doses so the person doesn't have to engage in the additional work of coming to the clinic. Joe Brady's been experimenting with mobile clinics that are on wheels, and they move around the community so that the person doesn't have to travel a long distance to an unfamiliar place, so forth. So you need to reduce the response cost, increase the size of the reinforcer so that the unit price is as low as possible if you're going to compete with an illicit economy that's working against you. Yeah, I was asked about the tax on cigarettes earlier, and let's take the tax on cigarettes, for example. Well, first of all, I don't really know what the elasticity of demand for nicotine is. But let's take hypothetically the possible case that it's inelastic. So what would happen if we raised the price of cigarettes by imposing a tax? Well, it's inelastic demand. Yes, it's going to reduce the consumption of cigarettes to some extent. But what's going to happen primarily is that there's going to be an increase in the amount of budget that's going to be spent on cigarettes by a majority of those who are smoking. It pushes the person so potentially towards considering the possibility of abstinence. But if it's inelastic demand, it's probably just going to increase the cost of maintaining their habit. But one alternative that you might combine with an increase in tax is to take the tax revenues that you get from that tax and use them to subsidize the cost of buying nicotine patches, so that you make the patches almost free. Now we've given the person a clear choice. You can buy these expensive cigarettes that have all kinds of adverse health effects, or you can buy the nicotine patch and potentially get yourself off the habit. And we'll make the patch real cheap. We'll make the cigarettes real expensive. And we can make the program pay for itself by putting the taxes back into the program. So there's no simple answer, but I think if we think in terms of providing substitutes, we may have a chance of having an impact. Now, there's one other aspect that's important, and that is discouraging first use. We're talking here about those who are already using cigarettes, and that's inelastic demand. There are many teenagers who haven't yet started to use cigarettes. Raising the price of cigarettes for them who have not yet started to use and for whom they do not yet have inelastic demand, that may be very beneficial in discouraging first use. And that's another aspect of the problem. Yes, sir, in the back. Right. Well, that was actually a study with baboons in a closed economy, and they didn't have the luxury of making those kinds of choices. But you're right. In the natural environment, the heroin abuser does not see it as an interlocking choice. They don't necessarily have to give up food for heroin. Now, in fact, even with the baboon in the laboratory, if you are giving the baboons relatively high doses of heroin, they become anorexic. They simply don't eat. And that probably has something to do with the pharmacological effects of opiates on one's appetite. And so it's not simple. It may not be a simple behavioral competition. There may be some physiological change in one's appetite that is attendant to high-dose heroin use. Yes, sir. Okay. That's a tough one. It's not tough. It's not that I can't answer the question. It's hard to answer it very quickly. One approach to this is to think about, remember those curves that I showed you earlier where we had saccharin and food demand. Remember when they were both available at a very low price, they were both consumed in equal amounts. And if we were to use any kind of pre-Mackian principle to define value, we would say that those two reinforcers had equal value. They were consumed in the same exact amounts when they were freely available. It was only when we imposed increases in price that we revealed the difference in the elasticity of demand. And we see this fanning out of the demand curves, and an increase in elasticity of demand for one, inelasticity of demand for the other. And so there is no, in order to understand value, you have to understand it in the context of constraint and how that reveals these differences. Now, that's not exactly explaining what I mean by value in terms of the matching law. Now, the matching law has been used to principally understand the choice between perfect substitutes, and there have been some applications of the matching law for qualitatively different reinforcers, but usually they've been studied in an open economy where we would expect elastic demand. Relatively few studies have been done in a closed economy. And it's only under those conditions where I would see the kind of interplay of the processes that I've been talking about today. But one thing that it might be interesting to observe is that when a subject is offered a choice between two perfect substitutes, it's not rational to go to two different stores and buy that exact same commodity at two different prices. Okay? The rational thing is either to go to the store that has it at the lowest price or to insist on paying the same price at both stores. Now, when you arrange ratio schedules of reinforcement, what you find is that the subjects go to the one store that provides it at the lowest fixed ratio or the lowest price. When you arrange concurrent interval schedules, the price that's paid is really as much up to the organism as it is up to the experimenter. How much they pay for the reinforcer is dependent on how many times they respond on a lever. It's an interval schedule. And so it happens that when a matching occurs, what is happening is that the subject is paying the same number of responses per reinforcer for the two alternatives. So matching occurs when the subject, through its own behavior, arranges to pay the same price for the identical sources of the same reinforcer. So another way of thinking about matching is that it's the subject that's arranging equivalent prices for an equivalent reinforcer, which is the rational thing to do. Right. Thank you.